Rain hammered Ashland Boulevard. Crowds pushed through with hoods up and eyes down. Nobody seeing the old woman gripping a traffic pole at the intersection, trembling, staring in every direction like she had forgotten where the world was. Peter had just finished his night shift, jacket soaked, wallet holding $6. He almost walked past her, too, but something in her eyes stopped him cold. He reached for her hand. One gesture. That was all it took to set fire to everything he had. And everything he had was not much. The warehouse on South Halstead shut its loading dock at 11:45 every night, and every night Peter Walker was one of the last men through the gate. Not because he was slow, because the overtime meant an extra $19 on his check, and $19 was the difference between keeping the lights on and sitting in the dark. He walked out into the rain with his collar turned up and his boots heavy on the wet concrete. The other workers split toward the parking lot, keys already jingling in their hands. Peter turned left toward the bus stop, then past it. The bus cost $2.25 each way. Walking cost nothing but time, and time was the only thing he had in surplus. His studio sat on the second floor of a brick 3-flat in South Side, wedged between a laundromat that never opened before noon and a barber shop that played music until midnight. The apartment was small enough that the kitchen and the bed shared the same conversation. A mini fridge hummed in the corner inside it, a carton of milk, 4 eggs, and a packet of instant noodles he had been saving since Tuesday. The walls were bare. No photographs, no framed degrees, no evidence that anyone had ever lived here long enough to leave a mark. Peter set his wet jacket on the back of the only chair and stood by the window watching the rain slide down the glass. His reflection stared back at him, 34 years old, built solid from lifting boxes 10 hours a night, face carrying the kind of stillness that people mistook for hardness. It was not hardness. It was practice. Years of learning how to keep everything locked behind a door that did not have a handle on the outside. He had learned that lesson early. 6 years old, sitting on a plastic bench at the Greyhound station on 95th Street. His mother had knelt in front of him, pressed her lips to his forehead, and said, "Mama will be right back. You sit here and be good." He was good. He sat there for 7 hours. She never came back. A transit officer found him after midnight, knees pulled to his chest, still waiting, still believing she would walk through those doors. She never did. After that came the system foster homes that blurred together like exits on a highway. Some were tolerable, a few were cruel, none were permanent. By the time Peter aged out at 18, he had lived in 11 different houses and learned one unshakable truth: people leave. They always leave. The only variable was how long it took them to find the door, so Peter built his own walls, not out of anger but out of arithmetic. If you never let anyone in, no one could walk out. If you never expected anything, nothing could be taken away. It was a simple equation. It worked. It kept him breathing. He ate the noodles cold standing at the counter because he never bought a second chair. There was no reason for a second chair. Nobody was coming over. The rain picked up outside. Peter pulled on a dry hoodie and stepped onto the front porch to lock the door. 2 units down, Ray Campbell sat on his own porch in a folding lawn chair, a can of beer resting on the armrest, completely unbothered by the weather. Ray was 67, a retired auto mechanic who had lived in this building since before the neighborhood had a name anyone wanted to say out loud. He had thick hands, a gray beard, and the kind of calm that only came from having seen everything at least twice. "You look like you got baptized, son," Ray said without turning his head. Peter almost smiled. "Just the walk home." "They still haven't fixed that bus route, huh?" "Bus works fine, just costs money." Ray nodded slowly, reading the situation without needing it explained. "Well, stay dry, Peter." Too late for that. That was the extent of their friendship, if it could even be called that. A few words on the porch, a nod across the hallway. Once during a blackout last winter, Ray had knocked on Peter's door and handed him a flashlight without a word. Peter had returned it the next morning, batteries still inside. Neither of them mentioned it again. It was the closest thing Peter had to a connection, and it was enough to keep him from forgetting that other people existed. He went inside, locked the door, set his alarm for 10 the next night. That was the pattern shift walk, noodles, sleep, repeat. It held for years. Peter did not question it. He did not fight it. He wore it like a coat that did not fit but kept the cold out, until one night it broke. Peter was walking back along Ashland Boulevard after his shift, rain falling harder than usual when he saw her. Not all at once. First, just a shape at the edge of the streetlight, a smudge of color that did not move when everything else was moving. People streamed past with umbrellas angled forward like shields, and not a single one of them altered course. A man in a business suit swerved to avoid her the way someone might step around a puddle. A woman with a grocery bag glanced over, then looked away, quickening her pace as though what she had seen might be contagious. The old woman stood at the intersection with both hands wrapped around the traffic pole. Her white hair was plastered flat against her skull. Her coat a good coat, expensive once, with a wool collar hung heavy and dark with rain. She was not screaming. She was not waving for help. She was just standing there, turning her head slowly from left to right, her mouth slightly open, her eyes scanning the storefronts like she was reading a language she used to know. Peter slowed. He had somewhere to be, which was nowhere, but still. Getting involved in other people's problems had never added anything to his life. He had learned that early, too. But the woman turned and looked directly at him, and something in her face made his stomach drop. It was bewilderment, the raw, unguarded confusion of a person who had woken up in the wrong life. He had seen that look before, every morning in his own mirror. He walked over. "Ma'am, you all right?" She blinked at him. Up close, she was older than he first thought, late 70s, maybe more. Her fingers were white, where they gripped the pole, trembling not from cold alone, but from something deeper. "I need to find Mr. Patterson," she said. Her voice was thin but precise, like a school teacher addressing a class that had grown too quiet. "He handles my affairs. I need to see him before he takes it all." Peter did not know any Mr. Patterson. He did not know what she meant by all. But he recognized the urgency in her voice, the sound of someone trying to hold on to something that was slipping. "Do you know where you live, ma'am? Is there someone I can call?" She looked at him for a long moment, rain streaming down her face. A small enamel pin on her lapel caught the streetlight, a tiny red apple, the kind teachers wore. It was scratched and faded, but she had pinned it carefully right over her heart. "I taught for 40 years, she said, as though that answered his question. Maybe it did. Maybe she was telling him who she was before the world started forgetting her. Peter pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The automated system told him the estimated wait for non-emergency dispatch was over 40 minutes. He looked at the woman, shaking, soaked, barely steady on her feet, and hung up. "There's a diner right down the block," he said. "Open all night. Let me get you somewhere warm, and then we'll figure out who to call." "That sound okay?" She studied his face the way someone might study a contract before signing it. Then she nodded. Peter offered his arm. She took it with both hands, and they walked together through the rain, a young black man in a warehouse hoodie and an old white woman in a ruined wool coat, while the city moved around them as if neither one existed. The diner was half empty. A waitress with tired eyes brought them a booth near the heater. Peter ordered a coffee for the woman, and nothing for himself, then watched $3.75 disappear from the $6 in his wallet. The math was immediate and automatic, $2.25 left. Not enough for tomorrow's lunch. He would figure it out. The warmth brought her back piece by piece. Her fingers stopped shaking, her eyes focused. She wrapped both hands around the mug the way someone holds a small fire. "You didn't have to stop," she said, looking at him clearly now, fully present for the first time. Peter glanced at the faded apple pin on her coat. "Neither did you," he said. Every time you stop for a kid in your classroom, something shifted in her face, surprise, then a softness that almost broke into a smile. "Natalie," she said. "My name is Natalie Whitfield." "Peter. Just Peter. Just Peter." Natalie took a slow sip of her coffee. Then she recited a phone number, haltingly reaching for it the way someone reaches for a word on the tip of their tongue. "That is my grandson's number? Derek? He will come." Peter dialed. It rang 3 times before a man picked up, voice sharp with the particular irritation of someone pulled from comfort. Peter explained the situation. The voice on the other end shifted immediately from annoyance to concern that sounded rehearsed, almost theatrical. "Oh God, not again. I will be right there. Thank you. Truly." 20 minutes later, a silver SUV pulled up to the curb. The man who stepped out was in his late 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a pressed button-down that had no business being that crisp at midnight. Derek Whitfield moved with the kind of efficiency that expensive upbringings produce, every step purposeful, every gesture calibrated to communicate control. He shook Peter's hand firmly. "I cannot thank you enough. She wanders sometimes. The doctor says it is part of the condition." His smile was wide and white and did not quite reach his eyes. Derek guided Natalie toward the SUV with one arm around her shoulders. It looked protective. It looked gentle. But as he leaned down to help her into the back seat, his mouth moved close to her ear and Peter caught 3 words that were not meant for him. "What did you tell him?" Natalie did not answer. She just looked at Peter through the rain-streaked window as the door closed. Her hand came up a small wave, or maybe something more. Then the SUV pulled away, its taillights dissolving into the wet dark. Peter stood on the curb for a long time. The rain had not let up. His hoodie was soaked through again, and his wallet now held $2.25. By every measure, he had less than he started with. But walking home, something sat differently in his chest. Not joy, that word was too bright for what he felt, more like the sensation of having been useful, of having mattered even briefly to another human being. He was not used to that feeling. It made him uncomfortable in the way that warmth makes you uncomfortable when you have been cold for so long that the cold has started to feel normal. He told himself it was over. He had helped someone. She was back with her family. That was the end of it. He did not know that 11 blocks away, Derek Whitfield was sitting in his home office with his door locked, typing Peter's name into a search engine. He did not know that Derek had already saved his phone number. And he did not know that the worried grandson who had shaken his hand so firmly was already calculating exactly how dangerous Peter Walker might become. Peter thought he had simply helped an old woman find her way home. He had no idea he had just walked onto someone else's battlefield, and on that battlefield he was the easiest target. 3 days passed. Peter went back to the warehouse, back to the loading dock, back to the rhythm that kept him upright. He did not think about Natalie Whitfield, or he told himself he did not. But twice during his shift, he caught himself looking at his phone, half expecting it to ring, and both times he put it back in his pocket and felt foolish for reasons he could not explain. On the 4th morning, it did ring. The voice on the other end was Derek's warm, unhurried, carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never had to rehearse politeness because it came standard with everything else he owned. He said the family wanted to thank Peter properly. A dinner. Nothing fancy, just a home-cooked meal, a chance to express their gratitude in person. Peter said no. He said it quickly and without explanation, the way he declined most things that sounded too generous to be real. Derek called again the next day. This time he mentioned Natalie. She had been asking about him, Derek said. She kept calling him the young man from the rain and wondering when he would visit. There was something in the way Derek delivered that detail, casual, almost throwaway, that made it impossible to refuse without feeling like Peter was abandoning her a second time. So on a Thursday evening, Peter took 2 buses to a neighborhood he had never been to. The houses grew larger with every block. Lawns went from patchy to manicured. Cars in driveways went from practical to polished. By the time he reached the Whitfield address, he was standing in front of a two-story colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch that was bigger than his entire apartment. He looked down at his boots, clean, but still warehouse boots, still carrying the faint scuff marks of concrete floors, and for a moment he considered turning around. The door opened before he could. Derek stood in the doorway in a navy quarter zip, smiling the way people smile in photographs they know will be framed. He ushered Peter inside, talking the entire time about gratitude, about Natalie, about how rare genuine kindness was in a city this size. Every word was polished. Every sentence landed exactly where it was supposed to. The dining room had a chandelier. Peter had never eaten under a chandelier. Natalie sat at the head of the table in a cream-colored cardigan, her hands resting on a placemat embroidered with small flowers. She looked different from the woman on Ashland Boulevard, smaller, quieter, folded into herself. But when she saw Peter, her face opened. She reached for his hand beneath the table and held it, her grip surprisingly firm. "You have kind eyes," she said softly, "just like my students used to say about me." Derek served roasted chicken, green beans, bread rolls that came from an actual bakery. He talked about the burden of being Natalie's primary caregiver, the sleepless nights, the doctor's appointments, the constant worry that she might wander again. He told it like a confession, a good man shouldering more than his share. Peter listened and nodded and said very little, because saying very little was what he did best. After dessert, Derek leaned back in his chair and made his offer. The family needed someone to keep Natalie company during the day, take her for walks, read to her, drive her to appointments. A companion. The pay would be $22 an hour, nearly double what Peter earned at the warehouse. Regular hours. No overnight shifts, no loading docks. Peter looked at Natalie. She was tracing the embroidered flowers on her placemat with one finger, humming something he almost recognized. She looked up and caught his eye, and there it was again, that unguarded openness, that willingness to see him without needing to know what he was worth first. He accepted. On his way out, Peter walked down the porch steps and onto the sidewalk. He glanced back once. Derek stood at an upstairs window watching him go. The smile was gone. His face held the flat concentration of a man running numbers in his head. Peter started the following Monday. He arrived at 9 in the morning, and Natalie was already sitting in the sunroom with a cup of tea and a book she had read so many times the spine had given up holding it together. She looked up when he walked in and said, "Oh, good. I was hoping it would be you." The first week was careful. Peter drove Natalie to her doctor's appointment, waited in the lobby, drove her home. He made her lunch, nothing complicated, just sandwiches cut into triangles, because she mentioned once that her mother used to cut them that way. He sat with her on the back porch in the afternoons, while she watched the birds at the feeder and named each species without hesitation, even when she could not remember what day it was. By the second week, the walls began to come down, not hers. Natalie started talking. Not the scattered, fragmented speech of the woman at the traffic pole, but real conversation, rolling and alive, powered by a memory that still held firm in places, even as it crumbled in others. She told Peter about her first classroom in 1973, a third-grade room with a leaking ceiling and 28 desks for 32 children. She told him about her husband George, who had died 11 years ago, and who used to bring her tulips every Friday for no reason at all. She told him about students she still remembered by name, a boy who could not read until she sat with him every lunch period for an entire year, a girl who wrote her a letter at graduation that Natalie still kept in her nightstand drawer. And then she asked Peter about his life. He gave her the short version at first, the version he gave everyone, which was almost nothing. But Natalie had spent 40 years listening to children who did not want to talk, and she had a way of sitting in silence that made the silence feel like an invitation rather than a wall. So Peter told her. Not everything, but enough. He told her about the bus station, about the foster homes, about learning to sleep lightly because some houses were not safe after dark. He told her about aging out of the system at 18 with a garbage bag full of clothes and an address for a shelter that turned out to be closed. Natalie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Her fingers were thin and cool, but her grip was steady. "You know what I told my students," she said. "Everyone deserves a place at the table, even the ones the world forgot." Peter did not answer. He could not. Something had lodged in his throat, the weight of hearing someone say out loud the thing he had spent his entire life trying not to need. For the first time in 34 years, someone was looking at him, really looking, and what they saw was not a problem to be managed or a body to be moved to the next facility. They saw him, and they did not look away. Then the cracks started showing. It was small things at first. One afternoon, Peter was helping Natalie sort through mail at the kitchen table when a thick envelope from a bank arrived. Natalie picked it up and turned it over in her hands, her face sharpening with a clarity that cut through the fog. "Is that my money?" she asked, her voice suddenly firm. Derek appeared from the hallway as if he had been listening. He took the envelope from her gently, smoothly, like a magician palming a card. "Just paperwork, Grandma. Nothing to worry about." He tucked it under his arm and left the room. Natalie stared after him. Peter stared at Natalie. Neither of them said anything, but something had shifted a frequency in the room that was slightly off-key. A few days later, Natalie and Peter were sitting in the sunroom during one of her clear spells, those windows of lucidity that opened without warning and closed just as fast. She took his hand the way she often did now, but this time her grip was different, urgent. "He is moving my money, Peter." Her voice was low and deliberate, each word placed like a stone. "I know he is. I have seen the papers. But no one believes a confused old woman." Peter felt the floor tilt beneath him. He did not know if she was right. The disease made things unreliable. She could be remembering something real or building a story out of fragments. And asking Derek was not an option because asking Derek meant questioning the man who signed his paychecks. So he held her hand and changed the subject, and the window of clarity closed and Natalie went back to naming birds. But the feeling stayed. The third sign came a week later. Derek called Peter into the kitchen and told him with the same practiced warmth he used for everything that Natalie's doctor had recommended she stay home for a while. No more walks in the park. No more drives to the bookstore. She needed rest, Derek said. She was overstimulated. Peter should focus on keeping her comfortable inside the house. Peter nodded. But he noticed that Derek did not look at him when he said it. He looked at the counter, at his phone, at the window, everywhere except at Peter's eyes. It was the first time Derek Whitfield had failed to perform his own sincerity. That night back in his studio, Peter thought about Natalie's hand gripping his, her voice low and certain, "He is moving my money." He thought about the bank envelope, the canceled walks, the world outside being slowly walled off. He told himself it was not his problem. Getting involved would mean risking the best job he had ever had. Getting involved would mean stepping outside the walls he had spent his entire life building. None of it made the feeling go away. Then, the ring disappeared. It happened on a Tuesday. Peter arrived at 9 and found the house already in disorder. Derek was in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight. Natalie sat in her chair by the window, eyes unfocused, hands folded in her lap. Something was different about her left hand. The diamond ring, the one she wore every day, the one her husband George had given her, the one she sometimes twisted when she was thinking was gone. Derek hung up the phone and turned to Peter. His face carried the precise expression of a man delivering bad news he had already rehearsed. "Grandma's ring is missing. The one from my grandfather. It has been in this family for over 50 years. Peter felt the shift before the words came. He felt it in the way Derek squared his shoulders, in the way his voice dropped half a register, in the way his eyes finally, for the first time, locked directly onto Peter with something that was not warmth. "I have called the police," Derek said. "I am sure this is just a misunderstanding." Two officers arrived within the hour. One was polite, one was not. They asked Peter to sit in the dining room, the same dining room where he had eaten roasted chicken under the chandelier, the same chair where Natalie had held his hand, and said he had kind eyes. Now he sat there with his palms flat on the table, while a man with a badge asked him when he had last been in Natalie's bedroom. Peter asked to speak with Natalie. Derek shook his head. "She is resting upstairs. The doctor gave her something to help her sleep. This whole ordeal has been very upsetting for her." The polite officer searched Peter's backpack, which he always left on a hook in the front hallway. He unzipped the front pocket, reached inside, and pulled out a ring. A diamond ring. Natalie's diamond ring. Peter stared at it. His mind went blank, then white, then very still. He had never touched that ring. He had never been in her jewelry box. He had never even been in her bedroom alone. But there it was, sitting in the officer's latex-gloved palm, catching the light from the chandelier above the same chandelier that had made him feel, for a few brief weeks, like he had been invited to a table where he actually belonged. "I did not take that," Peter said. The officers looked at Derek. Derek looked at the floor, his jaw tight, his hands clasped in front of him, the portrait of a man who did not want to believe the worst but had no choice. "I do not want to accuse anyone," he said quietly, "but Peter is the only person outside the family who has had access to this house." They put Peter in handcuffs in the front hallway, 6 feet from the hook where his backpack had hung. They walked him down the porch steps past the manicured lawn and into the back of a patrol car. Rain was falling again. Through the window, the neighborhood looked like a painting, clean, composed, certain of itself. Peter pressed his forehead against the glass. He understood with the cold precision of someone who had learned this lesson long before he could name it that no one was going to believe him. They charged him with theft of personal property and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The second charge carried the weight of a felony up to 5 years. The news made the local paper before Peter made it home on bail. The companion position was gone, obviously. But it did not stop there. The story traveled. Within days, Peter could not find anyone willing to hire a man with a pending felony and a booking photo circulating online. Someone shared that photo with the caption, "Another charity scam." It collected hundreds of comments from people who had never met him and never would. His landlord slid an eviction notice under his door before the week was out. Peter sat in his studio. The same bare walls, the same single chair. The mini fridge hummed in the corner the same way it always had. Nothing in the apartment had changed, but everything had. Before, the emptiness of this room was just how things were. Now it was proof. Proof that there was no one to call, no one to vouch for him, no one to stand in a courtroom and say, "I know this man. He would not do this." The public defender assigned to his case was a woman named Sandra Torres. She was sharp, overworked, and honest in a way that did not comfort him. She told him she believed him. She also told him she was carrying 47 active cases and could not promise him more than a few hours of preparation before trial. She said it without apology because apologies did not change caseloads. Peter sat alone that evening. He looked at the walls and thought about Natalie. Not about the ring, not about Derek. About Natalie's hand on his and her voice saying everyone deserves a place at the table. He had believed her. For a few weeks he had actually let himself believe that the equation he had lived by, expect nothing, lose. Nothing might have been wrong. That maybe there was room for him at someone's table after all. Now the table had been flipped, and he was on the floor and the room was laughing. He did not eat that night. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the dark window and let the silence press against him like water. Somewhere around midnight he heard a soft knock at his door. He did not get up. The knock did not come again. But when he opened the door the next morning, there was a foil-covered plate on the mat. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread. Still slightly warm. No note. He looked down the hallway toward Ray Campbell's door. It was closed. The folding lawn chair on Ray's porch was empty. Peter brought the plate inside and set it on the counter. He stood there looking at it for a long time. Then his shoulders dropped, and his hands came up to his face, and he wept, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet devastation of a man who had just discovered that someone still knew he was alive. The food was not the point. The point was that Ray had walked 12 steps down a hallway and knocked and left something behind. The point was that someone had stayed. While Peter sat in his studio, Derek Whitfield was building a fortress. He hired a private attorney, a man named Howard Gaines, who wore $3,000 suits and spoke to reporters the way a surgeon speaks to a patient's family, measured grave, deeply concerned. Derek appeared in the local newspaper, looking exactly the way he wanted to look, a devoted grandson heartbroken that the man he had trusted with his grandmother's care had betrayed them both. The photograph showed him standing on the porch of the colonial house, one hand resting on the railing, his expression carrying just the right amount of pain. Inside that house, Natalie was disappearing, not just into the disease, into silence. Derek had spoken with her doctor and explained that she had been making accusations claiming people were stealing her money, insisting that her grandson was the real thief. Paranoia, the doctor noted in her chart. Common in patients with her condition. A symptom, not a statement. And just like that, Natalie's voice was medically discredited. Everything she said could now be filed under confusion. She asked about Peter. Derek sat on the edge of her bed, held her hand the way he had watched Peter do it, and told her gently, "He was arrested, Grandma. He took your ring. He stole from you." Natalie shook her head slowly. The words coming at her did not match the truth she carried inside. But no one was watching. No one was in the room who would take her side. A letter arrived at Peter's studio from Derek's attorney. The language was clean, professional, final. If Peter agreed to plead guilty to the theft charge, the exploitation charge would be dropped. 6 months of house arrest, no prison time. A clean path forward, as clean as a felony plea could offer. If he refused, the attorney wrote, the family would pursue the full weight of both charges, 3 to 5 years. Sandra Torres, his public defender, read the letter across from him in a courthouse meeting room with fluorescent lights and a coffee stain on the table that looked older than both of them. She set the letter down and looked at Peter with the kind of directness that comes from having delivered this speech before. "Peter, I believe you," she said, "but believing is not evidence, and the system does not give second chances to guys who look like us." She recommended he take the deal, not because she thought he was guilty, because she knew how the math worked, and the math was not on his side. Peter stared at the letter. 6 months. He could survive 6 months. He had survived worse. All he had to do was sign his name and say he did something he did not do, and the machine would stop grinding. The court date was set for the following Thursday. The night before, Peter did something he had never done. He walked outside his apartment and sat down in Ray's folding lawn chair on the porch. Ray was not there. The chair was still warm from the afternoon sun. Peter leaned back and looked up at the sky through the gap between the buildings where you could see exactly one strip of stars if the light pollution cooperated. He thought about the diner on Ashland Boulevard, the coffee he could not afford. Natalie's hands wrapped around the mug, her voice saying, "You didn't have to stop," and his voice answering, "Neither did you." He thought about what it would mean to sign that plea, not what it would cost him in months or freedom or reputation, but what it would say. It would say that his kindness was a lie, that the man Natalie had seen when she looked at him, the man with kind eyes, the man who stopped the man who did not walk away, was fiction. It would confirm every assumption the system had already made about him, that he was what he looked like on paper, and nothing more. He thought about Natalie alone in that house, shaking her head at the truth no one would hear. Peter sat in that chair until the stars disappeared behind the clouds. Then he stood up and went inside and called Sandra Torres. It was late. She picked up anyway. "I am not signing it," he said. She was quiet on the other end. Then she exhaled. "Peter, I did not steal anything. And I will not say I did, even if it costs me everything." She did not try to talk him out of it. Maybe she had expected it. Maybe she had hoped for it. "Then we fight," she said. "But I need you to understand we are going in with almost nothing." "Almost nothing is what I have always had," Peter said. "I know how to work with that." He hung up and stood by the window. The rain had started again, tapping against the glass in the same rhythm it had played the night everything began. Peter did not have a good lawyer. He did not have money. He did not have evidence. All he had was the truth. And in America, the truth was not always enough. But it was his. And he was done letting other people decide what it was worth. Clare Whitfield had not visited her grandmother in over a year. She lived in Portland, worked in non-profit fundraising, and kept in touch with the family through the occasional text and a standing phone call on Sundays that Derek always answered on Natalie's behalf. When she saw the news article, "Caregiver arrested for stealing from elderly woman," she booked a flight home the same afternoon. Not because she doubted the story, because she believed it completely and she wanted to make sure her grandmother was safe. She arrived at the Colonial House on a Wednesday morning. Derek met her at the door with a hug and a long exhale, the practiced performance of a man carrying a weight the world could see. He told her everything, how he had hired Peter out of gratitude, how the ring had been found in the man's bag, how devastating it had been to call the police on someone he had trusted. The two of them had grown up close holidays at this same house, summers in the backyard, and Clare had no reason to doubt him. She listened and nodded and felt the anger build in her chest the way it does when someone you love has been hurt and you were not there to stop it. Then she went upstairs to see Natalie. The woman sitting by the window was not the grandmother Clare remembered. Natalie had lost weight. Her cardigan hung loose at the shoulders. Her eyes, which had always carried a brightness that made you feel like she was about to say something clever, were flat and distant. The room smelled of lavender air freshener layered over something stale. The curtains were drawn. Clare sat on the edge of the bed and took her grandmother's hand. Natalie looked at her for a long moment, the gears turning behind her eyes, searching for the name that matched the face. Then recognition arrived, slow and fragile. "Clare." Natalie's voice cracked on the single syllable. Her hand tightened. "Clare, he didn't take anything." Clare felt her stomach clench. "Grandma, the police found the ring in his bag. It's okay now. He's been—" "Derek did it." Natalie's voice was low but certain, stripped of confusion, stripped of everything except the raw insistence of someone who has been telling the truth to a room that refuses to hear it. "He is taking my money. He has been taking it for months. I tried to call Mr. Patterson. Derek would not let me. I went out that night to find help. Nobody stopped. Nobody except Peter." Clare pulled her hand back. Not because she believed her grandmother not yet, but because something in Natalie's voice did not sound like confusion. It sounded like testimony. That night, after Derek went to bed, Clare sat alone in the kitchen with her laptop open and her phone recording. She could not sleep. She kept hearing Natalie's voice, not the trembling, fragmented version the disease sometimes produced, but the clear, deliberate version. The teacher's voice, the one that had kept 32 third graders in line for 40 years. She started in Derek's home office. The door was unlocked because Derek had never expected anyone to look. Inside the top desk drawer, Clare found bank statements going back 8 months. Large transfers, $15,000 here, $22,000 there, all moving from Natalie's savings account into an account under Derek's name. She found a power of attorney document with Natalie's signature at the bottom. She had seen her grandmother's handwriting her entire life. The letters on the page were too uniform, too controlled. They did not look like Natalie. They looked like someone pretending to be Natalie. Claire photographed everything. Then she called the number on the old letterhead she found in Natalie's nightstand, the law office of James Patterson. The receptionist told her Mr. Patterson had retired 2 years ago, but a junior partner named Rebecca Walsh had taken over Natalie's file. Rebecca confirmed what Claire had been afraid to hear. Natalie had called the office 7 times in the 2 weeks before the night she wandered into the rain. Every call had been disconnected after less than a minute. The phone records showed the disconnections originated from the same device, Derek's cell phone. The next morning, Claire drove to Southside. She had Peter's address from the police report, which Derek had left in a folder on his desk as if it were a trophy. She climbed the stairs of the Brick 3 flat and knocked on the door of the second-floor studio. Peter opened it. He looked thinner than his booking photo. The apartment behind him was nearly bare, the single chair, the bare walls, the hum of the mini-fridge filling the silence like a pulse. He looked at Claire with the guarded stillness of a man who had stopped expecting anything good to come through his door. "My name is Clare Whitfield," she said. "Natalie is my grandmother, and I think my cousin did this to you. I am going to help fix it." Peter did not speak for several seconds. He looked at her standing in his doorway. This woman from the other world, the world with chandeliers and wraparound porches, and for the first time in weeks, the equation in his head produced a number he did not recognize. Someone had come to his door. Someone had crossed the distance. Someone was standing on his side of the line. He let her in. Everything moved fast after that. Rebecca Walsh, the attorney who had inherited Natalie's file, agreed to take Peter's case pro bono. Claire handed over the bank records, the forged power of attorney, and the phone logs. Rebecca filed a motion to review the charges and submitted the financial evidence to the district attorney's office. But the piece that broke the case open came from inside the Whitfield house itself. Derek had installed a home security system 2 years earlier, cameras in the hallways, the kitchen, the front door. He had deleted the footage from the night the ring disappeared. What he did not know was that the system backed up automatically to a cloud server, and the cloud retained footage for 90 days. Rebecca subpoenaed the records. The footage arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The video was 17 seconds long. It showed Derek Whitfield walking down the upstairs hallway at 2:14 in the morning, entering Natalie's bedroom and emerging 12 seconds later with something small in his closed fist. The next clip from the front hallway camera showed him opening Peter's backpack, the same backpack that hung on the same hook every day, and dropping the object inside. Then he zipped it shut, straightened up, and walked back upstairs. His face was calm. His movements were deliberate. There was no hesitation. The district attorney's office moved to dismiss all charges against Peter Walker. Simultaneously, they opened an investigation into Derek Whitfield for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult forgery and filing a false police report. Derek was brought in for questioning on a Thursday. For the first time, the mask came off. The calm, the composure, the polished concern, all of it collapsed under the fluorescent lights of the interview room. He shouted at the detectives. He told them Natalie was confused, that her mind was gone, that she did not know what she was saying. He said Peter had manipulated her. He said Claire was destroying the family. He said everything except the truth, and every word he said was recorded. The story hit the local news that evening. The headline read, "Grandson accused of embezzling from grandmother framing her caretaker." The same newspaper that had published Derek's photograph 2 weeks earlier, the devoted grandson standing on the porch with the perfect expression of grief, now ran that same image beside the new headline. The contrast said everything the article did not need to. Peter was cleared. Every charge dropped. His record wiped clean. But none of that was the moment that mattered. The moment that mattered happened 3 days later on a quiet Saturday morning when Claire called Peter and told him Natalie had been asking for him. Claire picked him up from the 3 flat on South Side and drove them both across the city in silence, the kind of silence between two people who had been through something together and did not need to fill the space. They pulled up to the house, the same porch, the same front door. But this time, when Peter stood on the steps, his boots did not feel wrong against the wood. This time, he was not an outsider being invited in. He was someone who had earned his place. Natalie was sitting in the armchair by the sunroom window, a blanket across her lap. She was thinner than the last time he had seen her. The disease had moved forward in the weeks they had been apart quietly, without announcement, taking small things first and saving the rest for later. Her eyes were cloudier. Her hands trembled more. Peter knelt beside her chair the way he used to when he read to her in the afternoons. He took her hand. Her fingers were cool and light like paper. Natalie looked at him. The recognition came slowly moving through layers of fog, reaching for something it was not sure it could still hold. Then her face softened, and she smiled the same warm, unguarded smile she had given him across the dinner table the first evening they sat together, when she held his hand and told him he had kind eyes. "You came back," she said. Peter held her hand tighter. "I came back. I knew you would." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You are not the kind who walks away." The words hit him in a place he had sealed shut a long time ago. His entire life had been a series of people walking away: his mother at the bus station, the foster families who kept him until they did not, the system that processed him and filed him and forgot him. He had built walls not because he was strong, but because he was terrified. If nobody could get in, nobody could leave. That was the deal he had made with himself at 6 years old, and he had honored it for 28 years. But Natalie had gotten in. Not through force, not through obligation. Through a cup of coffee in a diner and a hand held beneath a table, and a sentence about a place at the table that he had not been able to forget no matter how hard he tried. She had seen him. She had stayed. And now, sitting in this chair with her memory fading and her body growing smaller, she was telling him the thing no one in his life had ever said: that he was someone worth coming back to. Peter lowered his head onto their joined hands. His shoulders shook. He did not make a sound. He did not need to. The tears were not from pain. They were from the fracture of something breaking open that had been locked for so long, he had forgotten it was there. When he finally looked up, Natalie was still watching him. Her free hand reached toward his face, trembling, and rested against his cheek. "Kind eyes," she said softly. Then the clarity faded the way light fades from a room when clouds move across the sun, and she turned to look out the window at the birds. Peter stayed. He held her hand and watched the birds with her and did not let go. In the weeks that followed, the world rearranged itself around Peter Walker in ways he had not asked for. Clare established a trust to protect Natalie's remaining assets and pursued a civil suit against Derek. The community, shaken by the story, organized a fundraiser that raised enough to cover Peter's back rent and 3 months of breathing room. It was not a fortune. It was a foundation. Peter found work at a vocational training center on the west side, steady hours, decent pay. He signed up for evening classes at the community college. It was the first time he had written his own name on a document that was about his future rather than his survival. He visited Natalie every Saturday, not because anyone paid him to, because she was his family, now chosen, not assigned. Some visits she knew him, some she did not. On the days she did not, he held her hand anyway and told her about the birds outside the window, because that was what she would have wanted. He said yes when Ray invited him over for dinner one Sunday. They ate ribs on the porch and did not talk about anything important, which was exactly what made it important. Peter bought a second chair for his apartment. He put it by the window across from the first one. Most evenings it sat empty, but it was there. And the fact that it was there meant something had changed inside him. The walls were still standing, but now they had windows, and sometimes, on good days, a door. A few months later, rain fell on Ashland Boulevard again. The same stretch of sidewalk, the same streetlights casting their tired yellow glow across the wet pavement. Peter walked the route he had always walked, though he no longer worked the night shift and he no longer needed to save the bus fare. Some paths become part of you. You walk them because they are yours. He almost missed the young man sitting at the base of a tree near the intersection knees, pulled to his chest, a backpack clutched against his body like it held everything he owned. His head was down. His shoulders were drawn in tight. He had the look of someone trying to become small enough that the world might not notice him. The crowd moved past. Umbrellas, hoods, eyes fixed on phones, on crosswalks, on anywhere but here. Nobody slowed down. Peter stopped. He did not know this man. He did not know his name or his story. He did not need to. He had been that man once, sitting in that exact posture, waiting for someone who was never coming back. "You need somewhere dry," Peter said. The young man looked up. His eyes were red and exhausted, and surprised. Surprised that anyone had spoken, surprised that anyone had seen him at all. Peter held out his hand. That was how it worked. Not with speeches or grand gestures or the kind of transformation that makes for a good headline. It worked the way it had always worked, one person stopping when everyone else kept moving. One hand reaching out when every hand around it stayed in its pocket. Peter Walker did not become a millionaire. He did not write a book. He did not end up on television. He was still the man who went to work and came home and tried to live decently in a world that did not always return the favor. But he was no longer afraid to stop, because he knew that even when things went wrong, he would still be the man who reached out his hand. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. The world will always have people who walk past. There will always be rain. There will always be someone standing at an intersection, not knowing which way to turn. The question was never whether you could afford to help. The question was always whether you had the courage to stop. And if this story stayed with you, if somewhere between Peter reaching for Natalie's hand and Natalie reaching for his face, you felt something move in your chest, then maybe you already know the answer to that question. Maybe you have always known. If you are still here, it means something in this story mattered to you, and that matters to us. We tell these stories because we believe they deserve to be heard and because people like you choose to listen. So if you felt something today, leave a word in the comments. Just one word, whatever came to mind. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been that person standing in the rain, or someone who has been the one who stopped, share this with them. Sometimes a story finds the person who needs it most, not because an algorithm pushed it, but because someone who cared enough decided to pass it along. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one.